Greetings, everybody. Welcome to another installation of our Baker Institute Center for Energy's webinar series, where we've been exploring sustainability, waste management, and circular economy. Throughout the series, we've been discussing some of the issues and impacts of China's national sword policy, COVID-19, and the energy transition on the plastics economy and waste sector. And a term that we've oftentimes employed in our conversations are life cycle assessments, or LCAs as we'll call them today. And I've spoken from a very high level about what these are, why they're important, and some of the gaps in the current LCA methodologies, but we've never really unpacked it further than referencing its importance in understanding the bigger sustainability picture. So today we'll be looking at what an LCA is, what it isn't, its capabilities and its limitations, and how it can be used to evaluate energy technologies, especially in a time where companies and governments are aggressively pushing for integration of electric vehicles and renewables like wind and solar, and how they compare with traditional power systems. So I am joined here today by Mike Levy, who is a certified life cycle executive who has over 30 years experience in the chemical and plastics industry, working on a variety of issues around sustainability and contributing to the development of international standards, including ISO's working groups on environmental management, life cycle assessments, and circular economy activities. Also with us today is Dr. Sarah Marie Jordan, who is the Assistant Professor of Energy Resources and Environment at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And her work is aimed at uncovering the environmental and the economic trade-offs related to energy decisions, particularly those trade-offs related to the life cycle of energy technologies. So thanks to both of you for taking the time to join us today. And so what we want to do is we have a few polls that we're going to be pushing out to the audience throughout the webinar this afternoon. And so I'm going to go ahead and we're going to issue the first poll to the audience. Just to get a basic sense of where you are around life cycle assessments. And then we'll begin with a short presentation from Mike Levy, followed by another poll, and then a presentation from Sarah Marie Jordan. And we'll do another poll after that. And then we're going to move into a discussion and questions for the audience. And so for those of you that are new to Zoom, you can post questions to us in the Q&A section, and we'll try to just address those through the afternoon discussion here. So let's see, has the poll been issued? Okay, so the first poll, which one is considered a life cycle assessment? And then we'll be answering some of these, as we talk today and go through some of our presentations. So, Mike, if you want to begin with your presentation, and then once we get all of the answers from the polls, we'll have that pop up on the screen.
Okay. Can everybody see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Rachel. And my name is Mike Levy. I am with a senior associate with First Environment, an environmental consulting firm. And as Rachel mentioned, I have a lot of experience in the chemical plastics industry. Both Sarah and I are active in a group called the American Center for Life Cycle Assessment, where we try to basically help promote the ethical use of LCA, work with students in universities. So I'm really pleased to be able to talk to you today about the topics. I'm also vice chair of the U.S. delegation. We're one of 80 countries participating in the circular economy standards. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then finally, at First Environment, I do get involved with our clients in sustainability, circular economy, and life cycle advice. So this is an exciting field. Today, I'm going to briefly go through a little bit about what a life cycle assessment is, what it can do, what it cannot do. It's really aimed for the novices here for LCA. I'm not looking at the engineers changing their computers, cranking out the data. So hopefully you'll get a sense of that. We'll talk about circular economy and the ISO standards, and then how these two kind of interact. So what is life cycle assessment? I'm going to differentiate between life cycle thinking, which is basically taking into account the environmental, social, and economic impacts of a product over its entire life cycle. So on that little diagram off to the right, you can kind of see this concept of raw, from cradle to grave, extraction of raw materials, all the way going clockwise to manufacturing and use and reuse and disposal. So that's kind of the concept. Now, a life cycle assessment we'll get into is a very specific methodology. It's a quantification of the inputs, the raw materials and the energy that goes into a product, making any kind of product from cradle to grave, and then measuring all the emissions, which we call burdens, the amount of air, water, solid waste, and then what those emissions impact, like global warming or land use deficient. So again, LCAs are an important tool, and I'm going to briefly go through for you what an LCA can do. And basically, again, looking off to the right here, the concept is you're measuring all the energy that it takes to make something and the amount of materials, and then on the outflows, the burdens. But basically, an LCA could be used to identify value chain efficiency. Simply put, I call this the ultimate what-if tool. It's like a diagnostic X-ray that lays out, you take a snapshot of all of the burdens, all the emissions, all the inputs, and then you can look to see where the highest levels of, for instance, emissions are: solid waste, air, water, solid waste. And then you can identify where you can make some changes, whether you're a manufacturer, whether you're a designer, and then you can measure those changes. So the trade-offs of a life cycle assessment are really kind of the key to this tool. You're looking at a lot of different variables. You're not just looking at recycling. You're maybe looking at increasing recycling and see what impact it has on energy and fossil fuels. Also, this is a tool that could use document what we call environmental claims. A lot of people like to make marketing claims, for instance, based on information. An LCA could provide the necessary documentation to support a claim. So that's all fine and good, but what doesn't an LCA do? There's a little confusion sometimes out there about what it is and what it isn't. What it really doesn't do is measure the environmental product performance. So like this computer I'm using, if I did an LCA on this computer using certain plastics materials versus using other materials, what it doesn't tell me is if a Dell is better than another type of computer. It doesn't address compliance. In other words, if you have a manufacturing facilities and you've got air permits and water permits, those are different information you're getting. Also, it doesn't include what we call bricks and mortar. If I was going to do a life cycle study, for instance, on carry-out bags, what an LCA doesn't do is it doesn't measure the amount of bricks and mortar and everything to make the manufacturing facility to make the bags. So those are just some of the things that are a part of it. And then I'll just skip over here on the right. It's also not a risk assessment. And when I say that, if you're, for instance, looking at new materials that you might use for food packaging, you don't necessarily need to do a life cycle assessment. You more likely do a migration analysis following FDI guidelines, things like that. But in what an LCA doesn't do, it doesn't tell you the specific action to take, but what it does do is it lays out in this diagnostic way all of the burdens and the information so that when you do your what if analysis, you can actually see what's going on. So how do you decide if an LCA is the right tool? Again, if you're concerned about energy and environmental attributes, like today we're talking about energy transition and the clean economy, LCAs are really good to be able to measure the amount of embodied energy, fossil fuels, non-fossil fuels throughout the entire system. I already mentioned trade-offs. That's probably the most important part of an LCA. And this diagram below really kind of shows what it does. I mentioned you're measuring, energy, the amount of materials going in, and then the waste going out. from every step of the way: raw material, material manufacturing, product use and consumption, and then final disposal, which does include reuse and recycle. So for different approaches on what works best, we often tell people before you do an LCA, you should ask some basic questions. What are you trying to accomplish? What questions do you want answered? And who's going to use the results? So if I'm comparing, reusables and disposables, or if I'm comparing different types of systems to deliver goods, an LCA might be a good way to do that. And there's a lot of different types of LCAs. If you're just wanting a ballpark estimate, they have what they call a scoping and screening and simplified LCA, where you can use kind of published data and some raw assumptions before you drill down into a full LCA. A comprehensive life cycle assessment follows the ISO standards, where you actually collect a lot of data that measures the amount of energy and raw materials that go into making a product, and then you measure all of the burdens. There's a lot of databases now out there that can help you along with this. If you're doing product comparisons, the famous one I saw was looking at a natural Christmas tree versus a grown Christmas tree. That was always exciting to see what are the trade-offs there. And then there's something called attributional and consequential LCAs, which is getting into the weeds, so we'll skip over that one. So how does LCA fit into a circular economy, and what implications do they have for policy? The concept of a circular economy basically is saying, currently we live in what they call a linear economy, where we make something, we manufacture it, we use it, we dispose of it, and it hopefully gets properly disposed of, but sometimes it gets littered and there's pollution. So the concept of circular economy, in essence, is to say, how can we keep waste and products in the loop so that ideally we never really have to dispose it? It's kind of the ultimate recycling, reuse. It's like using the Uber model for products. So the concept here of a circular economy is to design products a little bit differently and to really take a hard look at the impact on energy in particular, on renewable and non-renewable energy. And then I'll get into what a circular economy society is going to look like and measure. We already talked about LCA and measuring environmental and energy. A circular economy also is going to take into account economics, return on investment. If you're going to make a new design product that's going to be a continual refillable, for instance, instead of a disposable, there's an economic incentive in there. And then the societal impacts, using natural materials, depletion. Those are some of the impacts that we're going to look like in a circular economy. Very briefly, there's an international standard organization activity going on that actually is being done in ISO right now. It started in May 2019. And just to show you the interest, there's 80 countries, including the US, that are really harmonizing and developing a circular economy standard. This is probably going to take about 3 years to develop, but there's a lot to be said. The concept here is to provide countries, organizations, firms, anybody that wants to basically develop circular economy projects to be able to measure through this kind of standard what is and what isn't a circular economy. And very briefly, I just want to kind of splash this up to you. And there's a lot of discussion right now on what's going to be in the definition of circularity or circular economy. We already talked about economics, environmental, social, life cycle thinking, the whole concept of regeneration, renewable resources, behavior change. How do we basically get from a consumption society to one that's going to reuse a little bit more? Again, these are all being discussed as we talk about. Here, I just want to mention to you all of the different players and drivers. And if you look at that chart, just to give you an idea, starting with the manufacturers in green, and then you go clockwise, you'll see the converters. Basically, those are the companies that now make products that we all use. The consumer brands companies that use those products, the retailers, the Walmarts of the world that sell it, consumers like you and me. And then what's the impact on municipalities, for instance, that are trying to fund recycling? Haulers, where do they come in? If we go to bio-based and composting, where do they come in? And then reprocessors. So this is a kind of a big loop. And circular economy really does affect much more than the manufacturers. So there's some politics of circular economy that are very interesting. As I mentioned, you've got 80 countries coming together to try to pull together uniform definitions. And the biggest issue right now is to determine how much life cycle should be used, for instance, as a scientific way to measure circularity versus a value-based approach. Value-based approach could be, say, banning certain products, requiring only fuels to be made out of renewables. There's a big discussion about how much of this should be really a life cycle scientific approach and how much should take into account some of the other reusables and disposables and some of that. So I like to show the emotional circularity that some people, including my favorite cat in the middle, are pulling their hair out. There's a lot of skepticism in this whole process that circularity is nothing more than recycling 2.0. We're going to recycle ourselves in the world. And yet there's, I think, an understanding that recycling is certainly part of it, but it's really a whole concept of rethinking and redesigning. Very quickly here, by combining life cycle and using it to actually assess circularity, circular projects, circular solutions, we believe that both of these are based in a systems approach. We're looking, from cradle to grave. We're looking at multi-materials. And for a circular economy to be successful, we want to make sure that if we're going to go to a certain strategy, that you're not impacting and having unintended consequences. That's where LCAs come in. So finally, as I turn it over to Sarah, standards historically are driven by market demands, and this is no different. And emerging policies come out of it. A globally accepted definition, whether it's a circular economy, will lead to further development. And countries and regions often develop these voluntary ISO standards as their own. So it's important for us to come up with a global solution. So the key takeaways for you is energy transition is underway to meet global climate targets and sustainability goals. Countries need to know how to measure all of this so that they can determine, if they're actually making progress in their impacts. And LCA and circular economy are really key for energy transition. So finally, I'll leave you with this. In today's debate, is climate change real and how can I figure out what to do about it? Well, this is where a life cycle can really help out. And my little meme on the right here will basically tell you. So thanks, and I'll defer questions because I believe Sarah is going to pick it up from here. And there is another polling out there. This morning, you guys were pretty good in saying which one is considered a full life cycle assessment. 68% said cradle to grave, and that's correct.
And Mike, we do have, and why don't we push out that other poll in the meantime, because there is a question for you, Mike, and it's around your comment about life cycle assessments not accounting for bricks and mortars. And the comment here is the execution of any strategy involves a value chain, each part of which bears its own costs. So if LCAs don't account for infrastructure and other costs, could you elaborate on the most efficient way to use them to inform policy or corporate strategies?
Yeah, when I say LCA doesn't take into account bricks and mortar, there are data quality rules when you do a life cycle assessment. For instance, there's cutoff rules on all the raw materials that go in. If you have additives and things that are like less than 1%. So the decision was made in the ISO standards early on that, for instance, if somebody was commuting to work, the energy and the fuel that you burn isn't necessarily part of a life cycle study because you would be going to work no matter whether you were comparing whatever it is that you're comparing for a life cycle assessment. And the same thing is with bricks and mortar. Now, if you wanted to analyze what the impact of building a new facility is, that would definitely, you would take into account the construction and the excavation and all of that. But what I'm saying is that if you're doing a typical product life cycle and you already have a manufacturing facility, the fact that that facility took energy to build it back in whenever it was built. That's not part of the LCA that you're doing. I don't know if that answers. Okay.
All right, great. Yeah, and so the other poll is up, and I'm noticing here on the polls, it doesn't allow you to select more than one answer, and there actually is more than one correct answer for these. So just keep that in mind, and maybe we could go through that once we get all of the results in. But I'm going to now move this over to Sarah. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rachel. So I will be talking a little bit more about the use of LCA within the notion of energy transitions, but also examining from both a technology and policy perspective. Just a quick note, I'm a faculty member at the School of Advanced International Studies, but I also have a secondary appointment at the Department of Environmental Health and Engineering. Before I start, I just wanted to make a note or two on my research group, the Energy Technology and Policy Assessment Group. We have 3 key tiers: life cycle assessment, techno-economic analysis, and a technology policy focus with a focus on innovation. So all of these clearly making a nice triad in terms of understanding the implications of energy transitions overall. My website is up there and can be made available to you if of interest. A few notes on collaborators. Clearly, ETAPA seeks to collaborate quite broadly with a number of different funders and collaborators in this research, primarily coming out of Johns Hopkins research, as well as a number of other funders. Okay, quick note, taking a scale back. So Mike gave a really great introduction to LCA. Keeping in mind in terms of energy transitions, there's a few broader areas which can make it relevant. So clearly we're interested in understanding whether or not there are important trade-offs or hidden environmental impacts that one might not necessarily perceive at first by making specific energy decisions. But of course, there's a broad range of applications. Product and process improvement. So can we determine an area where the environmental impacts can be decreased? Product declaration, stakeholder dialogue is a great one, and policy development. Now, clearly this is a bit contentious. Clearly, as Mike discussed, does it inform legislation? Well, it can certainly inform areas where there is a need to improve specific areas of environmental improvements. And of course, previously being interdisciplinary or engineering based, it's really transitioned into a very interdisciplinary field. I wanted to put up a couple of images here just to remind you all that LCA is really implicit to a lot of major decisions ongoing today. Where does the electricity for electricity vehicles come from? Of course, that's spatially and temporally dependent. The additional growth in the liquefied natural gas industry. So clearly that will lead to additional impacts in the additional supply chain segments. And while people, it is often overlooked, the keystone debate was really a life cycle assessment question. Okay, so what exactly does that upstream oil look like? And does it have a lot of additional impacts? So really a lot of these questions become of critical importance. So the goal of what I'm going to be talking about today, I'm going to really be addressing the fact that we're now entering a time where we can shift the focus of the life cycle assessment of individual technologies and say, hey, can we look more broadly to a grid or to an energy system? And now we actually have better access to data and information, so we're really starting to be able to do so. Of course, there are a lot of challenges in terms of understanding the regional differentiation, critical component. Okay, where exactly what is your grid, and what is the energy supply there? And so I'll be focusing as an example of a grid, several grids, on improving the spatial temporal understanding of grid scale LCAs, okay? So can we use this information to better understand energy transitions? I'll talk about 2 case studies. One is I'll start with the integrated optimization LCA model, so on the Western interconnection, but also then I'll focus on lesser recognized supply chain segments. So first looking at the Western interconnection, so this is part or all of 14 states in the United States, Canada, and the northern part of Mexico, very hydro dominated, about 265 gigawatts of generation capacity. So the idea behind this was, okay, so we're not going to just take a look at one technology and one particular model. We integrated two different models. So optimization, this is a Johns Hopkins stochastic multi-stage integration network expansion model. You don't have to say that if you have questions or write it out. You can just say Jasmine. It is a bit of a mouthful. So that is a co-optimized model which seeks to co-optimize generation, transmission, and operations. Now this is developed by my collaborator, Ben Hobbs, in the engineering department. So it simulates market adjustments. And the cool part is that it actually, as you look into the future, you can add on different configurations and understand better how the grid dynamics operate at an hourly level. Now, LCA usually doesn't get to that level of refined information. So when I found out that Ben was doing this, I said, hey, this is really neat. Maybe we can look to integrate these two types of modeling approaches. So I started working with them saying, let's include the supply chain. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory had recently done some work, which I'll use in both studies, looking specifically at harmonizing LCA results. So compiling a large amount of data and information on greenhouse gas emissions that can be used to better simulate what the upstream supply chain emissions are. And so then I ran a Monte Carlo assessment to look at uncertainty. So do we know where every single molecule of natural gas comes from? Well, that's tricky. It's kind of like saying exact bricks and mortar. Of course, we know it comes from a natural gas supply chain. We can say something about region. This study was more so on capturing the bounds of uncertainty. And we examined 21 different scenarios. Those scenarios included different configurations of renewables, storage, battery, as well as compressed air energy storage, new wind, and a number of different carbon pricing scenarios. So $20 per ton of carbon, 58 and 100. And so the neat thing about having access to more data, so it's really enabling LCA to transition as a field, is that using all this compiled information, I could characterize within bounds of uncertainty what the upstream emissions, supply chain emissions look like for all these different operations, okay? And using the Jasmine model, take a look at how the grid interacts and better determine on a more resolved resolution. And so this is an example of the types of results you can come up with. Okay, so you're like, wow, I thought there was going to be this big result. Well, there is. So give me a minute, we'll get there. So these are the individual technologies here. Okay, so as you imagine coal, petroleum, for example, being higher emitters, proven by this, many studies. And then we have the lower carbon sources here. So I'll usually never say an electricity generation type is zero carbon because there's always some upstream supply chain somewhere within the system's boundaries, okay? So then comparing to the scenario, so taking the generation of a whole bunch of representative units within the Western interconnection, 21 different scenarios running Monte Carlo simulation for each of those 10,000 iterations, came out, and what you see here are all the results for all the different scenarios, okay? So you can't tell too much the difference, so let's take a closer look. And what you'll see here is that, I'm just keeping an eye on time, is that it's really the carbon price that drives the impacts. And that's very important on the short term because we only looked at small amounts of reasonable generation capacity that we can add on the shorter term. So this really illuminates the fact that policy mechanisms such as carbon pricing can have a substantial effect. Another major benefit, what these analyses do at the temporal level is that you can really get at exactly where in a system you need to provide an intervention to be able to get to the actual impact. So transitioning LCA and adding new contributions can illuminate exciting results. So I have another 5 minutes. So I'll quickly go through this. Not all infrastructure is well characterized. Rachel correctly previously in our on a panel talked about different supply chain segments. I have an upcoming publication that addresses some of these as well. What happens to the solar panel after its end of life? Now, I'm going to focus here on transmission and distribution losses in the electric sector. So once an electron hits the power line, what happens to it? So what you previously saw was emissions per unit electricity generated, but a slight shift in the system's boundaries can provide some surprising results. So you'll see here, this is what this study looks at. So we're including those power lines, okay? So this is something I found in a prior paper, and I then started working with Dr. Kavita Sarana, the work published in Nature, saying, hey, how much of an effect can these inefficiencies have? So when we view these losses, view it as an inefficiency. So since there's an inefficiency, you need to generate more electricity in order for 1 kilowatt hour to reach a consumer, okay? So we'll call that compensatory generation. And what exactly does this mean, and how has it been examined? Well, we looked across nationally determined contributions for the Paris Agreement, and we found that of those that were submitted, only 32 countries mentioned these grid inefficiencies and their impact on emissions, on grid emissions, whereas 110 mentioned renewables. Now, this isn't to mean that renewables aren't important, but what we actually found, these are some of our results, is that these emissions can actually result in approximately 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions per year. We looked at 142 countries, examined the transmission distribution losses across all of these countries, and found it can result in 1 billion additional metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent a year. So if you think through energy transitions, it's a critical finding. I'm using our figure right here just to show that it depends, of course, on what happens moving forward. These scenarios say, okay, well, we're either going to develop in a way that respects Paris and Sustainable Development Goals or not, right? So the transmission, these green lines here don't mean that the transmission and distribution losses are less. That means that our grid emits less. So if you reduce those inefficiencies, you in essence protect the grid from losing the additional electricity generated by clean power, okay? So it might appear green, it doesn't mean it's green, or the transmission and distribution losses are still there. So a few additional comments. I'm coming up close to time, but I did want to point out a couple points. So there's some a very strong importance for countries to look within their own borders at very specified localized solutions in this case, because it can come down to replacing inefficient wires, particular innovations in use of superconductors, for example, or even for non-technical losses, okay? So non-technical losses are if it's pilferage, et cetera. You can look through tamper-proof meters, et cetera. So in the paper, we differentiated between technical and those non-technical losses. So just a couple of key points. I'm just going to focus on the main points here in the interest of time. So mitigation potential of overlooked supply chain segments can be quite substantial, okay? So really, and what we estimated was those emissions can approximately be cut by half by just reaching levels, average levels of the OECD, okay? So really pointing to the fact of a potential to reduce emissions, but also protect low carbon investments from grid inefficiencies. I also wanted to point out the importance of including and considering technology policy decisions and trade-offs, particularly during transitionary points, because in lower levels of technology enhancement, those policies such as carbon pricing can have a substantial effect on the ongoing operations of the grid, which can be characterized by the life cycle. And if we look at it at lower temporal resolutions, we can think through, are there particular interventions that can reduce the impacts that we might not otherwise have seen? So this type of new technique is really offering a lens through which we can make a difference. And finally, there's a lot left to do. So for those of you out there who are students or scholars, this is a very exciting time for the field. There are entire supply chain segments that remain poorly characterized. Rachel mentioned before in our prior talk that about solar panels. Also, there's a lot of research going on about recycling of wind, batteries. What are we going to do with all those in a low carbon transition? There's really a large need for more comprehensive data sets and a lot of mixed method potential. So I gave one example of optimization LCA today. And really, we're entering a time with more prolific data and more advanced computation. So that means that there's a lot of ability to advance the field in more groundbreaking ways that we hadn't previously considered. So with that said, quickly want to say thank you. Kavita Sarana we were joint authors on the Nature paper. And then the other work was with Ben Hobbs and Xingyu Xu, his student who's now at Princeton doing his postdoc, published in ESNT, and also a big acknowledgement to NREL for the harmonization work, which is publicly available. And that said, I'm going to pass to Rachel. And I do believe there's something else going on with a poll, another poll that's going to go out.
Yes, excellent. Thank you for that. And this one is, okay, why conduct a life cycle assessment? So I think what was, let's see, measure highlighting the efficient understanding, ensuring changes above here. Is this the second poll or the, I think there's a third one, or is this the answer? Well, nonetheless, let's, there's a question for you, Sarah, while that poll comes in. Here it is, the third poll. Thank you. For T and D, do you examine types and capacity of wires and transformers?
Oh, so what we did actually, because we did 142 country analysis, we would have loved to have data for all the individual transformers. Unfortunately, those data aren't available for that many countries. So we used International Energy Agency and World Energy Council transmission, broad level transmission and distribution losses. And then we used existing publication to disaggregate between technical and non-technical. So that's available in the paper, how we did that. And we did publish the estimates and disaggregated estimates in the supplementary information. But I really appreciate your question, because it really speaks to the need to think through some of these localized solutions. And of course, you know, if we had highly resolved data of that nature across a lot of regions, I think we might be able to consider a lot of different, you know, specialized solutions.
And then there's one more question for you, Sarah, is your transmission and grid assessment. Did you look at the cost of technology to reduce losses versus the gains?
Yeah, another great question. So that is something that we would like to do, because actually we are going, in one of my current publications, we're at least going to put some of that data together. We did look and we quantified some of the investments made by some countries at that broad scale into looking at particular programs. But there's a critical need, from my perspective, to really start nailing down in specific countries and regions what exactly those losses are, and developing those solutions, and developing cost comparisons about how to reduce them. So I think that's extremely important follow-on research. Now that we've really identified the problem, I'm hoping that we won't be alone in rolling up our sleeves and looking at the solutions too.
Thank you, thank you. And so I think we'll wait for that third poll to come in. This is the first time we're doing polls, so so we're trying to figure out how this actually works. But you know, throughout our webinar series here, we've been talking about circular economy, and you heard Mike touch on that in his presentation. And so question that I have for you guys is in relation to life cycle assessments. In the case of, for example, like a second life of a lithium-ion battery in an electric vehicle that may be fed into another application, like an energy storage system at the end of their first life, or solar panels that will hopefully one day be designed with end of life in mind, so it can be dismantled and reused. Where exactly does the life cycle assessment end for that first life? And where does it begin for the second life, or the post first life, I guess it's called?
So are you asking me? I mean,
yeah. Go ahead, Sarah. Go ahead.
So, well, you know, Rachel, it's kind of one of those "it depends" questions. It always depends on how you frame your systems right. In your analysis. How I would look at it is, if you are examining the environmental benefits of having a recycling program in place, then you would extend the production or generation lifetime of that original use, and then you would be able to compare the decrease with the new option against the case where there was not a particular option in place. And of course, there may be trade-offs, right? So if there is some form of recycling in place, there might be an additional mission that was previously not examined. So then you could start to think through the trade-offs of, okay, we don't have to deal with the disposal or dismantling, and who knows where that might end up, right? And then compare it to the case, and the different types of impacts. And correctly so, I gave just to point out too, I gave a few examples specifically focused on greenhouse gas emissions. The other great thing about your question, Rachel, is that it really speaks to the point that in general, if we're doing methodological advances like I was discussing, it's, sometimes it's important to hone in on one specific impact. But for broader scale product level assessments, clearly having a comprehensive suite of impacts is important, because you might overlook, for example, aspects of ecotoxicity or impacts to human health of dismantling in inappropriately or in unsafe ways. Whereas you might just see some emissions benefit. So I wanted to point out from our prior discussion that is one of the critical importance of understanding LCA and being honest and clear. And this is, again, speaking to Mike's comment about ethical use. It's important to point out the fact that clearly there are other trade-offs involved.
Okay, thank you. And I don't know, Mike, if you had a comment with that question.
No, but I'll just build on exactly what Sarah said, is that the goal and scope part of any of these studies is really critical with the boundaries. And the other thing is that within the concept of doing an LCA, there are allocation rules. So you kind of make sure that you're not double counting when you do your goal and scope. And I think Sarah rightly described whether you're going to include recycling on one end. So if you follow kind of those rules, you'll get an idea once you scope it out on exactly what some of the impacts would be. And then again, the multi-criteria, the multi-criteria of impacts that you're measuring is important to do a full LCA.
Yeah, it becomes pretty murky, right? I mean, because it's an entire network once it goes into another application, and we're global, and our waste management and recycling structures and systems are global too. So the data is hard to obtain for some of that. And so Sarah, you mentioned that life cycle assessments have revealed unanticipated environmental findings like hidden impacts in zero emission vehicles and trade-offs between, Mike, you mentioned this, between plastics and other materials. It's something that I grapple with at times is that life cycle assessments could conceivably challenge the idea of a circular economy framework and also the ingrained waste hierarchy perspective of reduce, reuse, recycle, compost, and landfill. And I want to get your thoughts on this in a moment, but so like an example, some life cycle assessments demonstrate that traditional polymers have a lower environmental and energy footprint than alternative plastics like biopolymers. And this result is hard for many people to accept. And also the economics and the environmental factors could really make or break the case for recycling. And I know this is not a popular position to take, but if from a life cycle perspective, recycling is less favorable than managing waste, say, in a controlled permitted landfill or in a waste to energy system, how do we feel about that? Would it actually be supported, especially in a climate that's pushing aggressively for a circular economy and zero waste? And when you start broadening that out to non-OECD economies that may not necessarily have these resources for advanced waste management systems, who may have to, in the short term, manage these in that way, because at least it'll prevent it from migrating to the environment. So these scenarios don't seem socially or politically compatible with or aligned with society's idea of sustainability. And as you have both said, many of our decisions in the energy transition are going to be informed by life cycle assessment. So if we truly want to meet these global climate targets and sustainability goals, shouldn't we lead, with data and science? And how do we balance that desire for this perceived sustainability with the reality of the LCA results that may run counter to conventional wisdom? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
So I comments, or Mike, do you want to go first?
Sure, and I think this gets to the whole point of saying that LCA is an important tool, but it's not the only tool. For example, during COVID, the whole concept of single-use plastics, which are often used in bringing kind of sanitized products from public health perspective, that goes a long way in reducing bacteria and germs and things like that. Those would say that, but if it's not properly disposed of and it's not recycled, then it's not good for the environment. So there's kind of a trade-off. And the same thing, for instance, like flexible packaging, the snack wraps and the flexible films and pouches. From a pure LCA perspective, even with zero recycling, they have a much lower impact on the environment. But if your focus is going to be on recycling, so there's efforts that are being made now to say that even though source reduction shows that that's a particular good product, we're going to also now look at maybe recycling it over and above. And then you have to ask yourself the question, is that the best use of materials, the way we make those kind of choices? So I remind people that LCA is important to look at the unintended consequences, but you also have to be looking at the health aspects of things, the safety aspect of things. And in developing countries, sometimes protecting the food chain is more important than, for instance, recycling, where you don't have an infrastructure that's being developed. And there are real challenges. Go ahead, Sarah.
Thank you, Mike. And great question, Rachel. So, and I'm going to say this too. I was actually, surprised and pleased when you brought up the solar panel and wind turbine questions, because, I say also something I've been doing a bit of work on for a couple of years, and the environmental impacts of renewables. Now becomes a political challenge. So first, I'm going to agree with Mike, it's not the only tool. But I'm going to then point something else out. The first step in solving a problem is recognizing it. As soon as you turn a blind eye, that's when it becomes problematic. And, clearly it's of enormous societal benefit to decarbonize the electric grid. Now, solar is great, wind is great. Yes, we want them to be part of the system. If we turn a blind eye to the fact that there's going to be an enormous amount of solar panels without recycling infrastructure in place, and the composites are for wind turbines are presently not recyclable, we're not going to be solving the problem. Okay, so while they might be even those, we're not even getting to some of the other things that, there might be trade-offs. If we turn a blind eye, then clearly we might be heading towards a large trade-off that's unanticipated. Now, do we turn a blind eye, or do we recognize and start to solve the problem? I lean more towards the second. It doesn't mean we should, yes, of course we should be transitioning, but we should be managing the problems at the same time, okay? Identifying and managing. I've done some work, I have a paper accepted with Becca Hernandez in Frontiers in Sustainability. It'll be out in the next few weeks, where we actually propose for the renewable sector a systematic approach to aligning the sustainable development goals with climate goals. So if we don't start to recognize some of these challenges, how are we possibly going to be moving towards ensuring that we're meeting not just climate goals, but all sustainable development goals in these very important energy transitions? So I agree with you. Sometimes it can be a bit shocking and not popular, but I have to be quite honest. On the other hand, I mean, my research doesn't pick and choose. I will report findings, and again, identifying these problems really is the first step towards finding solutions. Okay, so again, really important, in addition to Mike's point as to not the only tool.
Right.
Yeah, and so what on that, what about so we're looking at these days on sustainable development goals, and nowadays the contributions of corporations towards sustainable development is a major concern for a lot of investors and creditors and environmental agencies and governments around the world. And the use of ESG data, environmental social government data, governance data, and their disclosure and investment decision making continues to grow, and it'll likely continue to grow in a Biden administration. And so companies are making a lot of progress in the comprehensiveness and the performance of their sustainability management strategies. and it can affect a company's competitiveness, their financial performance, and long-term business success. And life cycle assessments, they add metrics to advance sustainability reporting, and they provide the groundwork for corporate social responsibility strategy. So it becomes necessary, I think, to have a common understanding of what an LCA is, how it's used, and how it can be misleading and misinterpreted, especially when it's compared across an industry. And so, there's a lot of there's a lot of standardization that's needed in ESG investment criteria, as well as life cycle assessments, and also the data that's reported by the issuers that enable these investors to compare companies' ESG performance for more fairly looking at these and to level that playing field. So knowing the stakes that are at play in company ESG ratings and the push for integrating renewables and to meet these sustainable development goals and climate goals, is there a risk of not having standardized LCA methodologies right now? I mean, should these two efforts be combined, or should they just be moving on separate tracks?
Well, Rachel, I'll take first shot at it, but that's a great question, and it hasn't gone unnoticed even at the ISO level.
That's what I was going to ask. Yeah.
Right now, any existing and new ISO standard, including the circular economy standard that's being developed, and the already existing since 2006 LCA standard, which is under review for every 5 years, they have to be now linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's now got to be part of the ISO process, because I think your point's well taken. There's a recognition that you can't do all of these different things separately. They have to be kind of linked together. So, and that's exactly what's going on now through the circular economy standards as we go and figure out how you measure it, how you define it. All the SDGs, those 17 kind of things have to be integrated. So I think that the concept here now is not just to develop an ISO standard, but how do you integrate it with the SDGs, the reporting, and everything that goes along with it. And that's different. That's definitely recognizing what's going on.
Yeah. Go ahead, Sarah.
Thanks, Mike. Just a quick comment. So this whole, hey, does this measure performance or does it not? And then isn't corporate reporting related to performance? Well, of course it is. I'm just going to point that out and also note that clearly what LCA can do is it can pinpoint specific areas. Hey, this is an area that requires improvement that companies then can use to measure their performance, because they know that's one of these hot spots within LCA. So again, these things they're not, while one is not equal to the other, there's certainly strong links between the two that can be informative and improve and decreasing environmental impacts.
Yeah. And just real quickly, I'll give the audience kind of an example on why LCA is such an interesting tool. Is that years ago, when we were looking at the impact of detergents and energy and hot water and usage and things like that, P&G back in the old days wanted to figure out how that they can play a role in trying to develop detergents that would have a bigger difference. So they did some LCAs. And they found out that the biggest use and the biggest opportunities wasn't in the manufacturing upstream or in their manufacturing, it was in the consumer use and how you use, your wash machines and everything. And that gave way to the development of the cold water detergents. And then they were able to show what the reduction would be in hot water and usage by coming up with a different formulation. First, they tried it in Europe, then the US, but that's an example on where, a tool like LCA kind of broadens the horizon and gives you an idea of where you can, make some big impacts along the value chain.
I want to ask you both about emerging technologies. And Mike, this is something that you and I had discussed when we were working on submitting that DOE grant. And I know, Sarah, in your work, you examined project level economics of emerging technologies and existing technology alternatives that can mitigate impacts. And current LCAs are lacking in their prospective assessments. They examining emerging technologies, they primarily look at lab scale. They look at things in a steady state or under status quo conditions. And And this comparability of LCA results from emerging and mature technologies is really needed for designers and process engineers when developing environmentally suited solutions. But there's so many challenges. Now, while the early assessments provide the greatest opportunity to influence the design and ultimately the environmental performance, it's at this stage, these emerging technologies, that we have the least available data and the greatest uncertainty, and just a paucity of analytic tools. And so in your work assessing new innovations, what approaches or methodological guidance should be taken for prospective, or I guess called like anticipatory LCAs of emerging technologies?
Yeah, I'll go quickly, but I'll give Sarah time to answer this too. What we're seeing, for instance, is in the development of chemical recycling and what they call advanced recycling, bringing it back to the polymer, is in order to be able to use, to analyze these from an LCA standpoint, is you need the data. So what we're seeing is some of these bench scale operations that are now in operation, and some of them have gone commercial. There's been LCAs that are being done. Also, some of the data on fuels have been updated in GREET and some of the models that are used by the federal government in Argonne. So there is an effort to try to populate the end of life information so that these new technologies, and some of these technologies have been around, but they haven't been analyzed to the degree. But you can analyze even a bench scale process that's being developed. There's some people think you have to commercialize everything, but they'll give you an idea of where it is. So, but you're right. The whole issue of recycling, both mechanical, regular, and chemical, is a real big one that's going to factor in there. And life cycle information is going to be a part of that. Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, no, this is a great question. And, and I do work in techno-economics and looking at lab scale work. So what's going on so what do you do when someone says, hey, take this experimental process and talk to these folks in the lab and tell us what the impacts are going to be at commercialization? Okay, it's not easy. It's actually really hard. And so my kind of big point to that question would be, what happens in the lab is not going to be exactly what it looks like on the ground. To whatever degree you can, those engineering models for these prospective estimates like Aspen and others can be really informative, or at least trying to construct a very reasonable mass energy balance, because how else are you going to possibly determine what the environmental releases are? I mean, this is a mass balance, right? So an energy balance, those are things that require some of that robust scientific knowledge. But that said, once it's ongoing, there are operational factors. So I would say that you can definitely say some things. You can make reasonable estimates of what prospective technology could look like. But clearly, as honest analysts, we have to just state, hey, you know what, this is taking into account, this is based on experimental data. We might be able to test some of the uncertainties and look at the sensitivity of specific parameters that we know might differ in commercial operations, but we just have to be very honest about the fact that this is extremely challenging, and which makes it a great question, right? Faced with a lot of uncertainty, how do you even know if the thing that you're assessing in the lab is going to really become profitable enough such that it is economic? So really wonderful question.
And then I guess the last, we do have one question here and just a couple of minutes left here. And so since there can be many ways to make guesstimates, how comparable are various LCAs undertaken by different companies and organizations and governments?
How comparable are they?
Yeah. I think one of the keys to doing an LCA is to follow the ISO standards. Those standards are really developed to put some credibility into conducting one, not taking shortcuts, making sure it's cradle to grave, so that even though you might get slightly different results, if you do follow what they call the ISO 14040, 44 standards, there's some sense that the study was conducted in such a way, you can make different assumptions and things like that, but there's a good chance that the data that comes out of that, you can compare it, but you're never going to get an exact number. I always kind of tell people, you're really looking for that trade-off analysis. And in conducting an LCA, you do what they call a sensitivity analysis along the way, which is to determine what variable will flip the result. So that's important to have that in these studies as you go along.
I don't know if I have time to make a quick comment, Rachel.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah, you got to look at the system's boundaries. You know, these things can be extremely different. So why follow the ISO? So us scholars, you know, we typically tend to publish, and the ISO would probably be relatively prohibitory in terms of our academic trajectories. But for organizations and firms particularly, extremely important, right? It ensures that transparency such that you can go in and take a very critical eye in terms of what exactly is in the system's boundaries versus what is out of the system's boundaries. Okay, so really it takes a lot of detail-oriented examination of the particular studies. Again, because I used in both my studies, I'll call out the NREL harmonization studies, and you can just, in the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, they did a great job of compiling an enormous amount of studies and then shifting or taking a look at the system's boundaries, making them consistent. So harmonization, for example, is one way you can think through doing that, and that would mean a lot of attention to detail in terms of how exactly each of the individual studies have been characterized, which were, if you're not an academic who publishes a whole bunch of supporting information from, you know, like we do, particularly if you're, you know, a firm, it would require that transparency that's embedded within the ISO standard. So wonderful question. Thank you, Rachel.
Yeah, and we are just past our time, and I have so many comments and so many questions, and from interpretation and communication of LCAs to land use and other things. But next time, we'll have you guys back next time. We can expound on some of these things and go deeper into these topics. But I want to thank you guys, both Sarah and Mike, for your time and expertise today. It was really, really insightful. We enjoyed that, and I hope our audiences have learned a bit, and I think the bottom line here is you know, having insights into the life cycle impacts and doing the analysis and understanding unintended consequences of new energy and low carbon technologies to help support this energy transition is really imperative to ensure that our decisions and solutions are consistent with sustainability principles. And so for all of you that are joining us, thank you. You know, we've held a number of webinars over the last several months. And we've received so many questions that we haven't been able to answer. So on our last webinar to close out the 2020 season, we'll be circling back to these unanswered questions. And I have with me Emily Topadlo from the U.S. Plastics Pact, and she's the executive director there, and she'll be joining me to help me answer some of these questions. We'll have a nice discussion on that. So please join us for our final program, Friday, December 11th at 3:30 p.m. Central Time. Sarah, Mike, thank you. Everybody in the audience, thank you so much.
All right.
Time.
Thank you.
Care. Bye, everybody. Bye.